This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is Ingmar Bergman's film Winter Light. I have Eric Hedling here to talk about it, and the conversation will begin in a moment. Eric Hedling is my guest. We will be talking about Winter Light by Ingmar Bergman. Eric, welcome. Before we get started, I give each of my guests a few minutes to tell a little bit about themselves. So if I could ask you who you are, what you do, and what your opinions of Bergman and this film particularly are.
Okay, I am a retired professor of film studies at Lund University in Sweden. And one of the topics that I have researched a lot is the career of Ingmar Bergman. And although there is a huge literature surrounding Bergman, I felt that his importance to Sweden was underemphasized, and that there is a lot of source material that is written in Swedish, which well, basically only Swedes and Swedish-speaking foreigners can access, and that's what I devoted a part of my career to.
So let's talk specifically about, for people who don't know who Bergman is, this comes about almost midway through his career. He'd already been making films for almost 20 years at this point. He'd had maybe another 20 or so to go. So this film, Winter Light, it's sort of like a dialogue of self and soul, really. You have characters. There's not much of what we would call in the modern film parlance action, but it's all internal. You have these wonderful characterizations that are, pretty much unique to Bergman, at least here in the non-Swedish part of the world. The film originally was called Nordvågstjärna, or The Communicants, and I guess Winter Light is its English language title. Tell me a little bit about the beginning of the film, how it got started, and the change of the title outside of Sweden.
Well, Bergman, this was at a moment in his career when he was heavily influenced by his then wife, Käbi Laratai, who was an Estonian concert pianist and of very accomplished. And she played him a lot of modernist music that he listened to, and that influenced his filmmaking in those years, primarily in between 1961 and maybe up to 1966. And they are sometimes, the films he made at that time are sometimes called his chamber plays because of the musical structure of them. And at this moment also, he was a very powerful man within the film company, Svensk Filmindustri, that he worked for. The director of the company had just died, and Bergman had several successors. He had a very senior position. Many claim that he was the real director of the whole film company. So he could do basically anything he wanted on film. So he made these 3 films: Through a Glass Darkly in 1961, Winter Light in 1962, and The Silence in 1963. And they're often connected through their sparse style, their austere setting, and their emphasis on character psychology, and also, of course, on various religious motifs. Although I have to say that anything that has to do with that is not my particular strength. Uh, I don't see that as the most important aspect of these films, but certainly to many that that was a very important aspect. Um, in fact, when I taught cinema in the United States, I was told that when Bergman's films came in the early 1960s, and they touched on questions of religion, that made them very serious, and students could tell their deans, we want to have film studies on the academic curriculum. And the deans often said that we're not going to study Hollywood movies here. But look, this Swede, he makes serious films about God. So that's how academic film studies started, according to some people. Um, so they are unique, and certainly unique, and make a very powerful statement within Bergman's career, certainly.
Well, here in the U.S., we look at, I mean, we're unfortunately quite a religious country, many sects and denominations, not only of Christianity but other stuff. We have this idea, though, in America that the Nordic countries, Scandinavian countries, are nowadays pretty much atheistic or agnostic. And this was 6 decades ago. I was raised a Lutheran. It seems to me that the church setting is also a Lutheran church. What is or was the import of Lutheranism in Sweden at the time, and is there any clash between how it's portrayed on the film and how it was lived in Sweden of the time?
I think it's very, it is very, it gets the situation just about right. Uh, Sweden today, I think, is considered the most secular country in the world. And that secular process of secularization really started in the 1950s, and which had to do with the rise of the Social Democratic Party, the creation of a welfare state in Sweden, and uh, the um, the church wasn't as important as it used to be, and that is exactly what Winterlight is about to a certain extent. And I think that Bergman himself struggled deeply with religion. His father was a pastor, and with a very strong Lutheran faith. And but Bergman was a doubter, and that is also depicted in those films, particularly in Winterlight. You see the name of the main character, played by Gunnar Björnstrand, is Thomas Eriksson, and Thomas, of course, famously is the doubting apostle, the one who wouldn't believe that Jesus was resurrected, or doubted the other apostles when they claimed that. And Eriksson, of course, is Bergman's autobiographical note in the film, because his father was Eric Bergman,
Mm,
and so he's the doubter.
mm.
That's what it basically states.
So let's talk just a little bit about Bergman himself and his own religious views. And to get back to what I had asked earlier, the title in Swedish translates to the communicants, which has a definitively a religious feel to just the terminology. Winter Light seems more secular. Do you think that was the title change outside of Sweden because they didn't think that a film so heavily uh, drenched in philosophical and religious questions could play outside of Sweden?
That's possibly so. I haven't seen anyone really dwelling on that. It's usually just stated that they changed the title. I think it's from Bergman's point of view. I think it's an ironic title because there are hardly any communicants
Yeah,
in
yeah.
the film. That's
It's a
that's one of the themes of the film. To me, many have seen it as Bergman's criticism of religion. I don't think that is the major. It's not any particular religious critique, but it's certainly a critique or dwelling on uh, on the demise of the church, which is depicted as very tragic.
Mm.
I mean, the main character, who is depicted as losing his faith, which of course is disastrous for a pastor. Uh, but that's I don't see that as a critique of religion per se. I see it as that Bergman dwells on the tragedy of cultural form, which is weakening
Yeah.
in Sweden at the beginning of the 1960s.
So the two main male characters are played by Bergman's two major leading men. The earlier one being Gunnar Bjornstrand, and this film sort of I think is about the last film that he is definitively the main character. After that, Max von Sydow becomes sort of the main male actor within the Bergmanian troupe. Um, Talk to a little bit about this sort of transitioning from the older generation in Bjornstrand to the von Sydow ascendancy within Bergman's canon.
Well, Bergman discovered Gunnar Björnstrand in the 1940s. Gunnar Björnstrand was at that time a comedy actor, and he was also performing in popular plays in the Stockholm theaters, not in the Royal Dramatic Theatre where the so-called serious plays were staged. So he was a comic actor, and at first Bergman used him as a comic actor, but then he discovered that there was a, a certain depth to Gunnar Björnstrand that he employed in two of the films that I mentioned. And one of them, of course, is Winterlight, and the other one is Through a Glass Darkly. Von Sydow is a different type of actor. I'm extremely keen on Gunnar Björnstrand myself. I think he's one of Sweden's greatest actors through the ages.
Um, so let's talk then a bit about the actual making of the film. Bergman was one of these filmmakers that seemingly he spent half the year directing stage plays, and then the other half he would do these films. And he averaged probably close to, if not a film a year for well over 20 years. It seemed to be a ritual for him. Do we? Can you tell me a little bit about the background of this film? Was there a personal incident that sparked it? Was it a memory of childhood, or was it just his own religious ponderings to himself? Because again, as I mentioned, this is, especially considering today, quite a religiously heavy and philosophically oriented film.
Yes. It's all of that, actually, I think. The background was, first of all, that Bergman had the artistic freedom to do anything he wanted, which is a unique position for a film director. He could do nobody would challenge him at that time. So he could do such a topic. There were several personal backgrounds to the film. Partly it had to do with the reconciliation of Bergman and his father. So they were driving around when Bergman was scouting for the film. He drove around little parish churches in the county of Uppland, which is north of Stockholm, with his father. And there was one incident when a pastor was ill, and there was a service, hardly any people there, and as the pastor was ill, Bergman's father offered offered to substitute for the because according to Bergman's father, the religious service must go on. I mean, and that impressed Bergman very much. And also, it's about the waning, the decline of Christian culture generally. I mean, there's hardly any churchgoers, and they don't express much belief either. And he saw that when he was driving around. The film was shot in the county of Dalekarlia, Dalarna in Swedish, which is a county which carries a lot of meaning for Bergman because he grew up there in the summers. His maternal grandfather had a summer house. So Bergman was very much acquainted with it and with the localities he was using for Winterlight. But also, as I said, it was inspiration from Kevilagetai, the musical structure. And there were also other things that inspired him, but also his own wrestling with the Christian faith.
So you'd mentioned Thomas Eriksson as being sort of the doppelganger in the film for Bergman because of the name choices. Let's talk about the three other main characters and their names and what they sort of represent in the film, because this is a very symbolic film as could be interpreted from what you've just been saying. So we have the couple played by Max von Sydow and Gunnar Lindblom, which is Jonas Persson and his wife Karin. Now, Karin is the name that appears quite often in Bergman's films, so it's sort of like that's the every woman name that he uses in a lot of his films. And Persson, obviously meaning person, individual, and Jonas, I know, is a version of Jonah, which is a biblical name associated with Jonah and the whale. Is that what they sort of represent, the every woman and a man who's swallowed up? Because Jonas seems to be cast in doubts. He's almost feverish, in his worries about the outside world.
Absolutely. I think that, well, the names are biblical, and it's no coincidence. Martha also, it has got something to do with Lazarus, I seem to remember. Mm. But it is a biblical name also. And of course.
Now you're saying Marta, did you say Marta, the woman played by Inga Thulin?
Yes, I think she's called Marta, which is the same as Martha, but it's
okay. And that's a variation of Mary, Mother Mary.
Could be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So because she is the one who is the doubter, she's in a sense the tempting. I is she trying to bring the main character into a new world? Is she trying to birth a new Thomas, in a sense?
Well, she does. She does try that, and she fails utterly. To a certain extent, she is the most interesting character
Yeah.
in the film. And I think one of the major aesthetic strengths of the film is the interaction between Thomas and Märta. That is Gunnar Björnstrand and Ingrid Thulin who plays her. And it, mostly in those dialogues they have, which are so cruel and frank. And I remember when seeing that film first in the 1960s, it was a shock. And to have that kind of dialogue when he says that he can't stand her, basically, that is Bergman at his very best, I think. Yeah. So she's a very interesting character. She is to have someone. He's talking about his wife, whom he loved, who is dead, and she tries to step in and take that position, and it's a complete failure, and he rejects her cruelly, and
Well, we,
it's
we, we hear that they did have a relationship, a sexual relationship, before the film begins. So he's rejecting her, but after using her.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. He says, I think he says at some time in the film that he wants to end the relationship because he wants to get rid of all the gossip surrounding them. Um, yes, but the rejection is depicted in an extremely artistically strong manner.
So let's then talk about the Pearsons as characters, because, as I mentioned, Max von Sydow's character is a worrywart, as we would say here in America. But he seems to be projecting his own inner insecurities out into the world. He's somehow how oddly concerned with the atomic or nuclear capabilities of China or other world powers somehow bringing an end to the world, and his wife seems rather meek and just sort of goes along with it for the most part. But it's clear that there's some kind of something wrong with not the Thomas, the Jonas character, because generally speaking, most average people are not going to be worried about the socio-political goings on of a country 8,000 miles away, whatever it is, from Sweden.
No, absolutely. Um, well, I think the character of Jonas is mostly it's a it's a very strong expression for the powerlessness of God, basically, because that's how it's depicted in the film. He wants to speak to the pastor Thomas about his concerns about the Chinese teaching their people to hate, and Thomas says in an extremely refined scene, he says that we have to trust in God, and the camera zooms up on his very much doubting
Hmm.
face. It's very strong.
Yeah, it's interesting because this film deals with some of these questions or whatnot, but Bergman also deals with religion in a much different way than someone like Tarkovsky, whom he admired. Uh, Bergman sees religion as something sort of to be that man has to put up with for good or ill, whereas Tarkovsky seems to more embrace it. It's more of a burden in the Bergmanian cinematic universe, as we would call it. Religion is a thing that has to be gotten over, gotten around, somehow dealt with. Whereas with Tarkovsky, it's about the embrace. Um, was that also Bergman in real life, that he just, that religion or religiosity was something that had to be dealt with, but it was something he would sooner have avoided?
Well, I think that now there have been many books written by people about Bergman and religion. Uh, well, Bergman turned during the course of the 1950s. I think Bergman was from a strong bourgeois background, and he adhered to very strong bourgeois values. And politically, I believe he was a non-socialist in the 1950s, but he turned to social democracy in the 1960s for many different reasons. And apart from that, a part of that was the gradual denial of Christianity. I do believe that Bergman turned religious again in his old age,
Mm.
and there are many signs of that during his later life. His support for the local church in where he lived on Fårö Island, for instance, and but he was part of the general sentiment of Sweden in the early 1960s, which was strongly pro-social democratic, uh, very much for the welfare state, and very anti-religious. And Bergman sort of got into that, and that can be seen in the films.
Before we talk about the actual narrative thrust of the film, I want to just talk about two aspects. One, uh, the music used in the film, and secondly, Sven Nykvist, the great cinematographer, and the way he uses light in this film. The light comes through in different ways and different angles through the church mostly. The outside world seems overcast but somehow blanched. Um, so, do you have any comments about the music, which is rather spare, and also the cinematography?
Well, the music is according to the Bergman aesthetic as at that time, as he was inspired by Kebby Larepay, which is a sparse use, very balanced use of music. In terms of cinematography, I think the film was very much an experiment. Bergman turned from his old cinematographer in the 1950s, Gunnar Fischer, and started to use Nyqvist and collaborated intimately with Nyqvist. And their main interest was to probe into the human psyche, uh, and by the use of those techniques, I think Nyqvist practiced a lot uh, on his use of cinematography in that film, particularly the lighting, and using in the churches where he filmed various screens and other thing in order to get that brightness into the depiction. It was a move away from the expressionist style of Gunnar Fischer in the 1950s with accentuated shadows and things like that, and now into new use of of light. But there is also, I think there is something religious in the use of, in Nyqvist's use of light, because they often, in that film, it often sort of indicates, paradoxically, somewhat paradoxically, the that the divine is present. So when they talk about God, occasionally you have little beams of light coming into it. It's extremely subtle and very sophisticated, I would say. It's a beautifully shot film. And I think that Susan Sontag, in a very famous essay on Bergman, although she didn't like Winterlight that much, she really admired the cinematography of the film.
So let's talk about the main narrative thrust of the film. We're dealing with basically two sets of characters: the Thomas, Marta, or Magda character, and then the Pearsons. The Pearsons are sort of dealing with the outer world and all the nervousness, the exigent woe, the the just sort of existential stuff out there with possibly the pending doom of the world, and then you have the highly intimate, personal aspect of the film as represented by Magda and her seeming obsession with a man who seems to revile her. And nowhere is this better seen than in the famous letter scene, which is one of the maybe 4 or 5 most instantly recognizable Bergmanian moments in his whole canon. It's a very daring piece where we hear a letter that was written by Magda to Thomas. I believe it's after their first encounter, sexual encounter, and his treatment of her. And what is it, 6, 7, 8 minutes, maybe
Something
even.
like that. Something
Yeah,
like that.
and it's just boom, the camera on the human face, Ingrid Tullin's face, and it's so daring a choice to make, and it's justifiably famous not only for that the visuals, but for what she says. So, if you could maybe give us a reason why he chose to do this, Bergman, and why it's so justifiably famous and daring an artistic choice.
Well, Bergman was a director who would do what he liked, as I said earlier, and that is an extremely strong scene. I remember when seeing it for the first time, I had never seen anything quite like it in the cinema. But it was in order to create that intimate feeling for the subtle psychological display of the interaction between Märta and Thomas. It's also interesting that Bergman used Ingrid Thulin in this for this role. Ingrid Thulin first appeared in the 1950s in Bergman's films, most famously in Wild Strawberries, where she's this ostensibly a wonderful person and wonderful woman. She is certainly meant to be beautiful and attractive and all that, but she's also extremely nice and very wise. After that, her roles in Bergman, the character she plays, interestingly declines. So, and this was the first instance of that. She I mean, the attractive woman we in all, not just looks. I mean, in all aspects, she from Wild Strawberries has gone through a metamorphosis into something that is not that pleasant, uh, and she's depicted as suffering from a rash, and she is not physically enhanced in any way in the film. She looks drab, and that continued into Lean's career, uh, and she got to play these extreme women, particularly in The Silence, for instance, where she is a cancerous and alcoholic woman who even masturbates on the screen. And this ends, of course, with the famous depiction she did in Cries and Whispers, where she um, cuts up her vagina with glass. And so that's a very interesting development in the use of an actor. Some say it had to do with Bergman trying to tease or annoy his friend Harry Schein, who was a very powerful figure in Swedish cinema circles in the early 1960s, and was also married to Ingrid Thulin. So she's an extremely complex and odd character to put on film. Have you seen the remake of Winterlight, the one Paul Schrader did?
No,
The
I haven't.
first
No, I have not.
reform.
No.
Oh, an excellent film where many of the scenes are exactly as they are in the original.
Is it called Winterlight?
No, it's called First Reformed.
Okay, First Reformed. Okay, I'll have to look that up.
2017, I believe.
Okay. Um, Now, the Magda character, even though we get a sense of her honesty and whatnot, looking at it with 60 years or more of hindsight, there's clearly something off about the woman. Maybe she might be considered autistic in today's world. She certainly has some kind of deep insecurities. She's a less, say, obviously noxious character than the one portrayed by Glenn Close in that movie in the 1980s where she's obsessed with Michael Douglas. I forget the name of the film.
Fatal Attraction.
Right, Fatal Attraction, yeah. You get the sense that there's something not quite right with this woman. So you have the two characters. You have a man who's losing all faith in the world, the God himself, and then you have this woman who wants to fill all those holes, but she clearly has gaping holes in her own soul.
Right. Yes. As he has as well. One should add. I'm not sure that you couldn't depict a female character like that today without there being strong protest uh, against it. She's just. I think she's quite glorious, actually, but she's not. She's not gaining much sympathy from the audience
Um,
or
so
from government.
after this sort of reverse scene with the letter is done, we get a second visit from Jonas, who's still obsessed with his own worries, much larger than himself. And we get the interesting background information about Tomas that decades ago he had served in the Spanish Civil War. He was in Spain during the war, and this casts a different light on, what could be his breakdown of faith now. Later, a few years later, when the movie Shame came out, we see how Bergman depicts war there in a very sort of oddly uncinematic way compared to most war films you would see even then or now. But it's interesting that they dropped that little tidbit in about Tomas's background. What do you think that says about the man and how it affects him in the present day of the film?
Well, I think that as the story goes, I think that that detail that he was serving at the time during the Spanish Civil War. He was working as a person in Lisbon. I think he was in Lisbon in Portugal, but he came close to see the atrocities of the Spanish Civil War, and that's how this sense of hopelessness started. That is to say, that God couldn't prevent those atrocities from happening. I think that's what it's meant to say.
Hmm. Um, and then the character that we just saw, Magda here, is listening to the conversation between Jonas and Tomas, and this is where we get that even though we see her as a character that is certainly not, I guess we would say not noxious or seemingly not noxious. We The fact that she is sort of lurking behind the walls and is hidden in the shadows of the church or listening into other people's private conversations. This again then gives a different spin to that character, and so you have these two characters, the one that we get background information of, and the other that reveals her own self by her own actions. That again sort of muddies things.
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, they're all part of a certain drabness that Bergman wishes to depict, uh, which I think is because he wanted to create a counter image of Sweden in 1962, where the general consensus was that everything was going uh, the right way. We are developing, we are good, we are wealthy, and Bergman wanted to create a counter image of that, which is the drabness, the general boredom, the lack of faith, which was not an issue in Sweden at the time, but it certainly is to Bergman. And I think it's also rather typical that she is not a religious woman. She is an atheist, if I remember correctly. She's depicted as an atheist. That is, she's not religious.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, that this is typical Bergman. He complicates matters, and there is always something that doesn't fit into your general understanding of his works. You always want to add these little nuances and details,
Mm-hmm.
which makes him such an interesting director.
So then comes what is, I guess, maybe meant to be sort of the pivot of the film. Uh, we learn that Jonas has blown his brains out in his
Yep.
existential angst, and yet this doesn't really seem to affect the two main characters who remain in their selfish little cocoons. Yes, they go out and they see the police recovering the body, doing whatever. They end up in the schoolhouse where Magda teaches, and instead of really talking about the dead man and whatnot, they go leap right back into their own solipsistic world there. Uh, uh, Magda is still obsessed with Tomas. Tomas, talks why he rejects her and whatnot, and he seems to have an almost disdain for Jonas, the suicide, that really puts him in a pretty dark position, especially for a so-called man of God.
Absolutely. And I think that, well, the suicide of Jonas is not shown in the film. We just see the body when when Thomas goes there and helps the police to put a tarpaulin or something on Jonas's body. And then they go into the school, which is a highly significant scene, I think. But mainly, I think that's about Bergman depicting people who care mainly about themselves. That's why they have that incredibly intense dialogue where Thomas says all those horrible things to Matt, that I can't bear you, and I loved my wife, and that was the love of my life, and I can't stand you, and
Mm.
all your little nasty habits.
And the film then basically, I think, has I mean, it's in a sense a very realistic, sober approach to life and the foibles and follies of people. Yet, I think you can look at the ending of the film where the two main characters end up doing what they're doing. It's time for the next service. It's an empty church, or practically empty. The other people who are there are sort of just going through the motions. We end up with Magda praying, probably praying that God will make Tomas see her in a different light again. And he's there fully doubting, but still going emptily through the motions. And to me, this is absurdism. I mean, this is very much Beckett-like ending, I think, that often isn't talked about. But I mean, these characters, they are the sowers of their own doom, basically.
Yeah, yes, um, I agree with you. I think but it has to. I mean, many people would experience Winterlight as an extremely boring film. And that has been some of the criticism leveled at it. That is a terrible drag to see, because it ends in nothing. I think during that church service, it's only the sexton and the organist who are actually there. There are no communicants or churchgoers at all. But that is the theme of the film. This is a waning culture. This is, and nobody really believes, and the major characters certainly are not believers. And to Bergman, I think this is tragic.
And yet, despite the tragedy, despite the absurdism, it's also very realistic because growing up, I grew up in New York City, and I remember growing up with a lot of people who would do nothing but complain. The city sucks, my job sucks, my wife sucks, but they never did anything to improve themselves. There's a certain kind of uh, uh, I guess we call it the self-loathing that some people go through, and they just don't want to change. And in that way, I don't see that the film could have ended any differently, given what we know to the. But by the time we get to the last scene, the denouement, what we know of these characters, they can't do anything but what they end up doing.
No, and I think that is, well, the generally pessimistic outlook of many Bergman films, most Bergman films. I would say they're about the nothingness of existence and the there's no way out. That's basically what he's saying in this film. It's very different, of course, in Fanny and Alexander, also in Wild Strawberries, but in Winterlight there is no mercy at the end.
Now, the premise, as I've stated and as is listed in the title for anyone watching this, is that this is a great film. What was its reception, though, upon release, both in Sweden and in the larger world?
It was so and so. I would say it was in Sweden. It was pretty solid because Bergman at that time was a national starting to emerge as a national hero because of his international reputation and all that. So he was. There wasn't any possibility to criticize him really in uh, in 1962. Um, some critics complained about the slow tempo and the general boredom, which I think is a that is part of what the film is about. It's
Yeah.
about boredom. Uh,
Ennui, basically.
yeah, yeah, and its international reputation. It was rather well received in the United States, for instance, not as well as several other Bergman films like Persona
Yeah.
or so, but it is a film which has gradually risen um, and become a more critically appreciated film over the years. I think it now has a very strong standing in the Bergman canon, not least because of the that scene you referred to in the schoolhouse
Yeah.
when they speak so openly and cruelly and terribly to each other. So it's more famous now than it was during its when it first came out. It's a short film. It's only 80 minutes or
Yeah.
so. So uh, to me, I think it's one of Bergman's tour de forces. I think it's a brilliant film,
So
actually.
you mentioned Paul Schrader had redone the film as first reformed in 2017. Let's talk about the film's legacy. Both, we've talked about the critics. Uh, how is the film seen by young filmmakers? I mean, is this something that people still will study in film school? Is this, seen as a touchstone film to understanding Bergman, number one, and also in finding a very action-less film in the Hollywood sense, but finding real drama within stuff? How is it viewed within the film community of filmmakers?
Actually, I don't think so. I think it's a film that would appeal to a director like Lars von Trier, the Dane, certainly. But I don't think, and obviously to Paul Schrader, who's also very much dwells on religious matters and came from a somewhat similar religious background uh, that Bergman did. Uh, I don't think I don't think that it's a film that's particularly appreciated by younger filmmakers. That's what I don't know, but I don't think so. I remember that at the conference I attended on Bergman
Hmm.
uh, years ago in Stockholm, we interviewed several film students, young aspiring filmmakers in Sweden, and they knew very little about Bergman. They were they didn't use him at all. They didn't study him at at film school.
Oh, that's
And, and I've never seen, as I said, I think it's a film that has gained strength within the Bergman canon over the years, but that's mainly among older critics.
mm.
I think Roger Ebert put it as one of the major films of something that that he did. But it can't be compared to films like Persona, not even to Cries and Whispers, I would say, certainly not uh, in the same league as Fanny and Alexander or some of the early Bergmans.
That's interesting. I would put it up in his top 3 or 4 films.
I would as well.
Yeah,
I agree. I
I mean,
agree.
Cries and Whispers. I know it was his first color film. I think Cries and Whispers veers towards melodrama more than drama, whereas this is strict drama. Um, but let me ask one question before we wrap up. I've often talked about what I call the sort of European style of full body acting. Here in America, especially in Hollywood, even in old Hollywood of uh, the first half of the 20th century, and certainly now in modern Hollywood, most actors just sort of react with their faces. There's no emphasis on the bodily movement. Uh, and I think of Sidow in The Virgin Spring, where the knight's daughter's body is found, and he's looking at the little rivulet, and he's got his back to us, and with the camera's about 20 or 30 feet behind him, and we just see the sort of slump of his body. We don't need words. We don't need to see the face. That slump of his body says all of the angst that and sadness that he's feeling. And certainly in the letter scene, we get this sort of wonderful map of who the Ingrid Tulin character is just from the sort of piercing of her eyes and the few times she lowers her eyes from the camera. Um, do you think what in modern Swedish cinema you said they don't even talk about Bergman? Is that sort of gone? Is modern Swedish cinema more like Hollywood than it is Bergman and Showman before him?
Oh, definitely, definitely, yes.
Yeah.
Um, um, Particularly in the 60s, you have to remember that in Sweden was permeated by a very strong ideology, and the government basically took over film production in 1963, and nowadays it's much more commercial and not at all that emphasis on what one has labeled as art cinema, which for which Bergman was a champion, certainly. So, but that is, I think, Bergman's greatness as a director is he was a he was intimately acquainted with the theater and with the expression of actors on the stage, and he directed plays all through his life from the age of 18. And, and what he knew, what he could do, that was the instruction of an individual actor in a role. That is his greatness. Some other directors are very good
Yeah.
at that as well, but Bergman was a master, I think.
Uh, the final question I want to ask is why you think the film was great. But before we get that, I just wanted, it just came to me as you were speaking. I wanted to ask you, as a historian of Bergman and Swedish cinema, I often found it odd that Bergman often took pot shots at a lot of some great directors. As I mentioned, he was very much a fan of Tarkovsky, but he didn't particularly think much of the works of Antonioni. And it's odd because to me, Antonioni and Bergman are sort of filmic twins. The only difference is Antonioni looked at humanity through the lens of a telescope from afar, whereas with Bergman, he was looking at humanity with a microscope. Do you have any comment on, I guess, Bergman's opinions of other filmmakers and specifically about Antonioni?
I think you're absolutely right. Antonioni and Bergman are children of the same spirit,
Mm.
basically. And it's that extremely pessimistic outlook on the world, which they depict by different means.
Yeah.
Uh, and when I taught cinema for 30 years, I often compared Bergman and Antonioni, but I'm aware that Bergman was not a particular was not a great fan of Antonioni. He was a fan of Fellini, though,
Mm. Yeah.
and as you said, of course, of Tarkovsky. Maybe Antonioni and Bergman was too much alike and
Mm.
wanted to say the same things about the world and life.
So let me just ask you then, for anyone who is just coming to this film or coming to Bergman, uh, can you just give a brief summary as why they should watch the film and why this film is great?
Well, they should watch it for partly for film historical reasons. I think the interaction between Thomas and Märta, that is Gunnar Björnstad and Ingrid Thulin, is quite unique. And there are not many instances in world cinema that's like it before Bergman did those scenes. The letter scene, which you mentioned, and the scene in the schoolhouse,
Mm-hmm.
and that extremely aggressive, although not aggressive in tone, but aggressive in content, in to what Thomas actually says to Märta. That is, I think, one of the strongest parts of the film. But generally, I think Winter Light is a masterpiece. And you could say that depicting boredom and drabness by being boring and drab. That is certainly one of the points of the film. But you it's well, I've seen that film at least 15 times or something like that, and it always strikes me, although I had difficulties with it at first.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank you, Eric Hedling, for sharing an hour of your time to speak about this great film. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Dan. Thanks.